No engineer could make the yacht sail until she said, "I can try." She had lost everything to the sea, her father, her job, and the courage to return. The place that had once been her refuge had turned into a bitter memory, filled with failures she could never forget. Years later, while trying to live far from the docks, a piece of news broke the silence. The most expensive yacht in the world was stranded, unable to move, and no engineer could make it run. Madison Cole hadn't planned on going back, but that distant sound of an engine struggling to breathe seemed to be calling her once more. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Florida sun reflected off the silver hull of the Odyssey 1, the most ambitious yacht ever built by Ward Oceanic Systems. The deck gleamed like a floating runway, and the shipyard buzzed with tension. Engineers rushed back and forth. Technicians shouted coordinates, and the metallic clang of tools echoed through the salty air. Ethan Ward, the billionaire behind the empire, watched it all with an unreadable expression, his hands clasped behind his back, his light suit moving with the warm breeze. The watch on his wrist marked the minutes they could no longer afford to lose. In just a few hours, international investors and journalists would arrive for the launch event, and the main engine of the Odyssey 1 was still dead. The hybrid system, the pride of the company, had completely frozen. Technical reports pointed to synchronization failures between the control software and the propeller torque, but no one could reverse the collapse. With every failed attempt, the sound of the sea around them seemed to mock the team. Ethan took a deep breath and said with that controlled calm only the powerful possess, "If the Odyssey 1 doesn't sail today, Ward Oceanic sinks with me." Not far away at the public marina, Madison Cole was packing her tools into a rusted box. The smell of oil and salt clung to her skin, and the wind carried the faint noise of the luxurious shipyard. For months, she had been repairing fishing boats and small motorboats, avoiding any contact with the world she had once belonged to and fled from. But that morning was different. The news echoed from local radios. The most expensive yacht in the world was stranded, even with the best engineers trying to save it. Madison looked out at the sea and felt something stir deep inside. The same instinct that had guided her since childhood, when she used to follow her father around the docks, and he told her that every engine had a soul. You just had to listen. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, she grabbed her wrench and started walking along the sand toward the private shipyard, unsure if she would even be allowed inside. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from something stronger, the sense that the faint metallic hum in the air was calling her name. Security almost stopped her at the gate. Madison explained that she was a mechanic and knew the Ward hybrid systems used torque controllers that could fall out of sync if the current flow sensors were even slightly misaligned. The guard raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Before he could send her away, one of the engineers overheard her and snapped irritably, "You think we didn't try that already, lady? Go back to your workshop." Laughter echoed among the scattered tools and cables. But the remark drew another gaze, the gaze of Ethan Ward, standing near the yacht's boarding stairs. He watched her with curiosity, the wind moving through the loose strands of her hair, her eyes locked on the vessel as if she could see beyond its surface. "Let her speak," Ethan said. Silence fell instantly. Madison took a deep breath, stepped closer to the stairs, and with grease-stained hands pointed toward the propulsion compartment. The problem isn't in the propulsion system. It's in the alignment of the auxiliary gyroscope. The system's fighting itself. "I can prove it." The engineers exchanged incredulous looks. Ethan kept his eyes on her and said only two words, "Prove it." Madison climbed aboard with her heart pounding. The deck gleamed, and the grandeur of the yacht contrasted sharply with her simple clothes and oil-stained boots. She grabbed a multimeter from the workbench and knelt by the system panel. The engineers watched from a distance, some mocking, others silently waiting. She shut off the main power, opened the control compartment, and placed her fingers on the metal, feeling the faint vibration still pulsing beneath. Adjusting the phase sensor, she read the values and murmured to herself, 2 degrees out of sync. She turned the connector and manually reprogrammed the alignment code. The panel lit up with a soft blue glow. Ethan stepped closer, his suit reflecting the hull's lights. "How long?" he asked. 5 minutes, she replied. The sound of cables, fans, and the generator coming to life spread through the yacht. A low hum echoed. The hybrid engine began to spin again, smooth and steady. The silence that followed was broken by restrained applause and stunned looks. Ethan watched the scene without speaking for several seconds. The engineers looked at Madison as if she had performed magic. One of the technicians checked the readings and announced, "Everything's stable. No torque errors. No phase drops." Ethan turned his gaze back to the woman in front of him, her hands still resting on the panel as if calming it. "Who are you?" he asked. Madison wiped her face with her forearm, still catching her breath. "Someone who used to build ships before losing everything to the sea." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. He studied her closely, the vibration of the engine humming under their feet. "Then maybe the sea's calling you back," he said, not as an invitation but as a statement. Madison's eyes flickered for a moment, caught between pride and pain. Ethan extended his hand. "Stay. Help me finish what we started." She hesitated for a second, then took his hand, without realizing that this gesture would change the course of her life. Hours later, as the Odyssey 1 glided out of the shipyard, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon, its golden reflection turning the sea into a liquid road. Madison stood beside Ethan on the command bridge, watching the waters open ahead of them. He said little, but his gaze was different, the look of a man watching a mystery finally being solved. "I've never seen anyone work like that," he said at last. "Engines talk, Mr. Ward. Most people just don't know how to listen." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then keep listening. Tomorrow we leave for the Bahamas. I want you on board." Madison turned her face to the sea, feeling the salty wind on her skin. For a moment, memories of the past tried to resurface. The accident, the fear, the guilt, but the steady hum of the Odyssey 1's engine kept her grounded in the present. For the first time in years, the sea didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a beginning. Dawn, over the Palm Beach shipyard, brought a sharp brilliance that shimmered across the still water and the silver hull of the Odyssey 1. Madison arrived early, carrying a small bag and a clipboard filled with notes on the hybrid system. Ethan Ward was already waiting for her at the dock, dressed in a light suit, his expression composed, flanked by 2 senior crew officers. He greeted her with a brief nod and led her toward the main stairway. "The team is still fine-tuning the synchronization data. I want you monitoring every reading during the crossing," he said firmly. Madison acknowledged, breathing in the humid morning air and the faint mix of fuel and salt. Around her, men in immaculate uniforms were preparing cables, checking valves and adjusting controls as if performing a ritual of precision. The contrast between that refined environment and her modest life was striking, yet Madison's focus remained entirely technical. When the Odyssey 1 pulled away from the dock, the vibration of the turbines traveled up through the floor beneath her boots, reminding her of what she feared most, the unpredictable power of the open sea. During the first hours, the atmosphere on board was strictly formal. Ethan reviewed reports, spoke with investors, and kept a steady eye on the readings from the main console. Madison stayed near the control panels, analyzing system stability. The display projected precise torque, temperature, and power load values, yet she noticed small oscillations in the sensor output. She jotted down notes quietly, comparing numbers and listening to the turbine's rhythm the way one listens to a heartbeat. The crew, initially skeptical, began to observe the confidence behind her movements. She wasn't intimidated by the scrutiny surrounding her. When she detected a slight phase lag between the port control and the auxiliary engine, she clearly reported the deviation and proposed an immediate correction. The chief engineer verified her calculations and gave the order to adjust. Ethan, watching from a distance, took note of how calmly she asserted herself through logic and competence. It wasn't arrogance, it was technical conviction. As the Odyssey 1 advanced into open waters, the horizon stretched endlessly blue. The strong wind stirred the deck, and the sound of waves mixed with the steady drone of the hybrid engines. From the command bridge, Madison observed every detail, her hair tied back loosely, her gaze fixed on the readings. With every mile, her confidence grew. The sea was no longer a stage of fear. It was once again the place where she felt most alive. Ethan watched her discreetly, noticing the total focus in the way she worked. He approached and asked, "Is the system performing as expected?" Without looking up, she replied, "Within the ideal range." "Stable alignment confirms the gyroscope correction worked." Ethan gave a brief nod, satisfied. The exchange was short, professional, and precise. But he understood something important. She grasped the language of the sea in a way his engineers, for all their technology, still didn't. By afternoon, the first real challenge arrived. An unexpected fluctuation in the ballast system altered the yacht's lateral balance. Warning lights flashed red as the crew hurried to assess the issue. Madison requested permission to switch to manual control, and Ethan gave the signal. She adjusted the compensation valves and reconfigured the airflow within the stabilization tanks. Within 3 minutes, the readings returned to normal. One of the officers, astonished, muttered, "That would have taken an hour with the old team." Ethan crossed his arms and simply replied, "She's here for a reason." Madison wiped her hands with a rag and continued monitoring the screens as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, it was just a job done right, the kind of result that came from attentive listening and respect for the machine. The silent approval of the crew was more rewarding than any applause. As night fell, the yacht sliced through the calm waters with perfect stability. On the main deck, the cool air carried the scent of salt, while the waves' rhythm blended with the soft hum of the generators. Madison stood near the portable maintenance console, recording data for the final report. Ethan passed by and handed her a folder filled with technical documents and the mission schedule. "I want you to review these parameters before we recalibrate the electric propulsion system," he said. Madison flipped through the pages and replied matter-of-factly, "I can do it tonight." "There's noise in the inverter readings that could indicate saturation." He listened quietly and gestured for her to proceed her own way. There were no compliments or unnecessary formalities, just trust. And that trust was all Madison needed to keep going. The hours stretched beneath the dark sky, the sea resting in near silence. Alone on the bridge, Madison watched the reflection of stars scattered across the water's surface. The steady pulse of the Odyssey 1 served as a reminder that her hands had made all of this possible. For a brief moment, her thoughts wandered to her father and brother, to the years she'd stayed away from the ocean, to the countless times she'd doubted her own talent. The pain hadn't disappeared, but something within her had shifted. The sea no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a demanding ally, one that rewarded courage. Ethan returned briefly to the bridge and found her standing quietly before the panel. "Everything running smoothly?" he asked. "It is," she answered, "and it will stay that way as long as we remember the sea always speaks first." Ethan smiled faintly, understanding the depth behind her words. The Odyssey 1 continued forward, steady and illuminated beneath the peaceful night sky, and Madison realized that, for the first time in years, the sound of the sea no longer frightened her. The voyage had been calm until the horizon began to twist beneath thickening clouds. The radar showed abrupt drops in atmospheric pressure, and within minutes, the temperature fell sharply. Madison was studying the readings on the control panel when a deep rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, followed by the automated navigator's warning, "Critical variation detected." Ethan stepped into the main cabin and glanced at the central monitor, where a red blotch on the map indicated a tropical storm forming directly in their path. No forecast had predicted it, but nature didn't ask permission to change course. "Shut down the auxiliary propellers and redirect power to the stabilizers," Ethan ordered, his voice steady but tense. Madison entered the commands, but the system failed in the primary circuit. The Odyssey 1 lost rotation and began to tilt slightly to starboard. The roar of the wind blended with the rising crash of waves slamming against the hull. "We've lost autonomous navigation," she said, already moving toward the manual control panel. Ethan gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the radar. Fully aware of the danger closing in, the rain came down in sheets, pounding the deck like iron. The yacht rocked violently as the crew rushed to secure hatches and collect loose equipment. The automatic system flashed red alerts across the console. Madison scanned the control matrix, her eyes moving rapidly across lines of code and electrical indicators. "The gyroscope's locked up. We need to reconfigure the feedback loop, or the system will overcompensate and roll us over," she shouted, pushing her soaked hair back and switching to bypass mode. Ethan watched silently, letting her take command. "Deactivate autopilot. Manual routine now." "I want real-time torque readings," she ordered. The technicians followed her voice without hesitation. Madison crossed the deck toward the stabilization compartment, gripping the handrails as the ship shook under the assault of the waves. The emergency siren blared intermittently, and the sharp scent of ozone filled the air. From the stairway, Ethan saw her open the lower control panel, sparks flickering as she worked with quick, precise movements that seemed impossibly calm amid the chaos. The waves grew dangerously high. With every impact, the deck shuddered, and the Odyssey One groaned as if the hull itself were testing its limits. Madison kept her composure. Her voice cut through the noise. "Restart the ballast system. Drain tank 2 and equalize tank 4. The engineers obeyed instantly, and the yacht's lateral balance began to stabilize. But then, a loud crack echoed. The main panel sparked violently as a bolt of lightning struck the upper antenna, overloading the entire circuit. Ethan moved toward her, but she was already crouched beside the control board, flipping the central breaker. "The system won't reboot on its own," she said, pulling off her gloves and reaching for an insulated tool. "If we don't reconnect manually, we lose everything." Ethan tried to stop her, but she was already kneeling among the tangled wires, reattaching melted connections and reactivating the propulsion module's power feed. A metallic snap reverberated through the cabin, and for a heartbeat the screens flickered blue before coming back to life. The glow from the monitors lit her face, focused, calm, unshaken. The next few minutes felt endless. The radar showed the storm's eye passing directly over them, the engines straining against the violent current. Madison kept her eyes on the readings, adjusting power distribution and energy flow as the wind shifted direction. Ethan stood beside her, ready to execute every order she gave. The crew moved with precision, guided by her commands, relayed over the ship's intercom. The storm's roar reached its peak, a deafening wall of sound that made the metal vibrate underfoot. Then, after one last flash of lightning that turned the sea white, the noise began to fade. The waves calmed. The pressure normalized. The yacht steadied itself on course. Madison exhaled, wiping the rain and sweat from her face. Ethan glanced at the screens, all readings glowing green again. "It's stable," she confirmed, stepping back and resting her hands on her knees. He replied quietly, "You just saved 50 lives." As the rain eased, the deck was covered in shallow pools of water, and the sky slowly began to clear. The crew emerged from the hatches, exhausted but relieved. Some exchanged silent looks. Others began to applaud. Madison stood still, catching her breath. Ethan approached and handed her a towel. "You spent too long near that panel," he said, his voice carrying a trace of concern, uncharacteristic of him. "You okay?" "I am," she answered hoarsely. "The system will need a full inspection, but the hull held." He nodded, studying her steady composure. No arrogance, no self-congratulation. "I did what needed to be done." Ethan looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was breaking through the clouds. "And you did it better than anyone could have hoped." The Odyssey One continued at reduced speed until the sea fully calmed. Inside the cabin, the engineers were rebooting auxiliary systems, the constant hum of the machinery filling the air like a reminder of survival. Madison stayed alone in the command room, reviewing each reading. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes remained fixed on the monitors. Ethan returned and stood behind her for a few moments, saying nothing. He simply watched the woman who had kept control when everyone else had lost it. For a man who had built empires on numbers and precision, what he witnessed went beyond engineering. It was humanity in its purest, most deliberate form. When she finally turned around, he said only, "Without you, this would have ended differently." Madison replied calmly, "With the right team, it may not be easy, but it ends right." He nodded, wordless. Outside, the ocean had returned to its deep blue. The Odyssey 1 sailed steady again, and the distant wind was now just a quiet reminder of what they had survived. Their return to port was greeted by headlines and camera flashes. Within hours, news of the storm had spread across international media. "Engineer prevents mid-sea disaster," read the titles on websites and television channels. Madison's image, covered in grease, her uniform drenched, circulated across every network. During the impromptu press conference on the pier, Ethan Ward credited her for the operation's success, declaring that the Odyssey 1 was living proof that innovation thrives on the courage to start over. While reporters crowded for quotes, Madison stayed back, observing from a distance. She didn't feel like she belonged in that world of flashing lights and microphones. All she wanted was to check the system, run diagnostics, and make sure the yacht was truly safe. Ethan called her up to say a few words, but she quietly declined. "Let the ship speak for me," she said, and he respected that. As the crowd dispersed and the noise faded, Madison returned to the lower deck and immersed herself in the failure reports. Unaffected by the chaos growing outside, the next morning, Ward Oceanic's headquarters were buzzing. Ethan had called an emergency board meeting to address 3 points: project stability, system safety, and the leadership of the technical division. When Madison walked into the glass conference room, she was met with mixed reactions: admiration from some, distrust from others. Most visibly hostile was Caleb Ross, the company's director of engineering, a man with a firm voice, an impressive resume, and an ego to match. He looked her up and down before speaking. "With all due respect, Mr. Ward, I'm not used to seeing structural decisions made on the basis of emergency improvisations." Ethan folded his arms. "Improvisations save lives when theory fails, Caleb." His tone was sharp, and the silence that followed was thick. Madison remained composed, refusing to justify herself. Ethan then announced that she would take over as technical coordinator for the Odyssey 1 through the next testing phase. Caleb forced a smile, but the look he gave her made his irritation clear. Over the following days, the rhythm of work shifted. Madison was given a small team of experienced technicians and began a full review of the propulsion system. The previous reports, signed by Caleb, contained errors that seemed far too basic to have been overlooked by a senior engineer. When she cross-checked the torque logs and temperature data, she found deliberate inconsistencies, minor enough not to raise alarms, but significant enough to cause failures during operations. Nothing catastrophic, just subtle flaws that could discredit the project if left unresolved. She documented everything and sent a technical summary to Ethan, recommending an internal audit. Hours later, she received a terse email from the legal department. Her system access had been temporarily suspended, pending credential verification. Caleb had acted fast. "Predictable," she muttered, closing her laptop. There was no room for naivety. She copied her backups to a flash drive and kept working offline. Meanwhile, the company's visibility soared. Investors from Europe and the Middle East met with Ethan, eager to fund the new line of sustainable yachts. Madison's name appeared quietly in news reports and interviews, described as a rising mind in naval engineering. To Caleb, each mention felt like a provocation. In meetings, he went out of his way to downplay her role, crediting the project's success to collective effort. Ethan, buried under an international schedule, rarely caught the venom behind those words. But when he finally sensed the tension, he called Madison into his office. "I've been warned about discrepancies in the reports," he said. "What's going on?" She answered without hesitation. "Intentional errors, Mr. Ward, and they're not mine." He frowned, resting his palms on the desk. "You have proof?" Madison met his gaze. "I do, but it may not be enough." Ethan's expression hardened. "Then give me what you've got. I'll take care of the rest." Behind the scenes, Caleb grew bolder. He called in loyal technicians, altered calibration codes, and manipulated data sheets with surgical precision. His goal was clear: quietly sabotage the system and make it look like Madison had made a fatal mistake. A deliberate leak in the ballast tanks nearly caused the yacht to list during a demonstration for investors. Madison caught it in time, isolated the problem, and corrected it. But the damage was already done. Whispers began to spread about her supposed inexperience and recklessness. Ethan convened another meeting, this time with a sharper tone. "I don't want accusations without evidence," he warned, "but I want results. From now on, everything we deliver must be irrefutable." Madison stayed focused, refusing to defend herself publicly. After the meeting, she went straight to the testing bay, checking every valve, every line of code, every circuit by hand. She wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. 3 days later, she found it. Hidden deep within the torque control system was an unauthorized calibration file dated 2 weeks before the storm. The digital signature belonged to Caleb's account. Madison compiled the evidence, wrote a full technical report, and sent it directly to Ethan. She didn't wait for a reply. Instead, she grabbed her badge and went to the dock where the Odyssey 1 sat silent and moored. She walked across the cables, running her hand along the cold metal structure as if drawing strength from it. Hours later, her phone vibrated with a short message. "Come back to the office, urgent." When she arrived, Ethan was waiting, holding her report. His expression was grave. "You were right. Sabotage confirmed. Caleb's been suspended until further notice." Madison exhaled, finally releasing days of tension. Ethan paused, then added, "But now everyone will be watching you even more closely, including me. Prove that trusting you was the right choice." Madison gave a steady nod. His trust wasn't a gift, it was another test, and she had no intention of failing it. The next morning began with an uneasy silence inside Ward Oceanic. The corridor leading to the technical division felt colder than usual, and the few voices echoing through the glass walls carried a cautious, almost distrustful tone. Madison arrived early, swiped her badge, and entered the main lab, where a small team awaited her. On the central table, the Odyssey 1's control system lay dismantled. Exposed cables, open power modules, and diagnostic tools ready for review. Since Caleb's suspension, she had officially taken over testing operations, but the atmosphere remained tense. Every technician seemed to weigh their words carefully before speaking. Madison stayed focused. "No distractions," she said firmly. "We're reviewing every circuit line by line. I want triple redundancy verification on all readings." The team obeyed without hesitation. In the background, the sound of typing blended with the metallic rhythm of tools. Outwardly, the company presented an image of stability. Inside, everyone knew that trust was an even more fragile system than the hybrid engine itself. Hours later, an urgent report landed on Ethan's desk. One of the smaller prototypes, used for investor demonstrations, had suffered critical propulsion failures during open-sea testing. The pilot reported severe vibrations and partial loss of control, the exact same conditions that had nearly destroyed the Odyssey 1 weeks earlier. Ethan read the report and called Madison to his office immediately. "You need to see this," he said, handing her the tablet. The readings showed identical patterns to those caused by Caleb's tampering. "He couldn't have had remote access after the suspension," she said, scanning the graphs, "unless someone left the authentication keys active." Ethan frowned. "And someone did?" "Yes," she replied. "Someone on the maintenance crew." Without waiting for further orders, Madison grabbed her portable diagnostic kit and requested permission to join the field team. The plan was clear: intercept the control signal and trace the source of the sabotage before the prototype was lost for good. The sky was overcast as their speedboat reached the testing site, 20 miles off the coast. The waves were rough, and the small experimental model pitched violently, its engines sputtering between power surges and near shutdowns. Madison crouched near the rear console and began scanning the signal frequencies. Ethan, who had insisted on accompanying her, kept the radio open with the control center. "We've got 30 minutes before the next investor window," he warned. "Plenty of time," she said, her voice steady. On her tablet, she detected an irregular transmission interfering with the sensor readings. Following the digital trail, she located the compromised system's signature. "The transmitter's inside an auxiliary module," she said. "Installed manually during the last maintenance cycle." The boat's operator paled. "That could trigger a full short." "It could, and it will, unless we cut it now." Madison opened the panel with an Allen key, shut down the main power, and isolated the faulty circuit. Within seconds, the engine stabilized. The vibrations ceased. Ethan stood silent, realizing that this confirmed the worst. The sabotage hadn't been the act of one man. Back at the port, tension turned into investigation. Madison compiled a detailed report, listing every technical trace connecting Caleb to two of his trusted employees. The software manipulations had been coordinated across the internal network. "They wanted more than to push me out," she told Ethan. "They wanted to prove the Odyssey 1 was flawed, to kill the project and open the door for competitors." Ethan listened quietly, eyes fixed on the glass wall of his office. "Ward Oceanic may be my name," he said, "but that ship is what keeps it relevant. If they destroyed the project, they'd take everything with it." Madison's tone stayed practical. "We can still recover the system's integrity, but we'll need a complete platform reset." Ethan nodded. "Do whatever it takes. You're in charge." The order was made official, and within hours, Madison's team was back in the hangar, dismantling and reinstalling the software core. No previous data would remain. It was a total rebuild, and the future of the company depended on it. The next 48 hours became a marathon. Madison barely left the lab. She survived on coffee, energy bars, and brief naps, speaking only when necessary. The steady hum of the ventilation system and the blue glow of the monitors gave the space the feel of an endless night. As the new system began to take shape, she allowed herself brief moments of reflection on how she had once walked away from engineering out of fear of failure. Now she was rebuilding not just code, but her own bond with the craft that defined her. Ethan often passed by during the night, watching silently. In her discipline, he saw something he had lost long ago: purpose. When the main panel finally lit up, every reading stable, Madison exhaled a long, exhausted breath. "It's ready," she said. Ethan stepped closer, scanning the screens. "Then let's test it." It was nearly midnight when the Odyssey 1 returned to sea for the first time since the storm, gliding through the water with flawless precision. No errors, no vibration. By sunrise, the yacht returned to port in silence, greeted by quiet applause from Madison's team. Ethan gave no speech and called no reporters. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "The ship's clean. So are we." The internal investigation led to the dismissal of those involved and to Caleb's arrest on charges of corporate fraud and sabotage. The press called it the biggest case of industrial espionage in modern nautical history. But inside Ward Oceanic, the feeling was different. The project had survived, and with it the company's reputation. Now officially appointed as Director of Engineering, Madison walked the halls without letting the attention affect her. She knew that trust could be earned, but responsibility never faded. From a distance, Ethan watched as she entered the Odyssey 1's control room once again. There was fatigue in her eyes, but also serenity. The mission was complete, and for the first time, he was certain the company was in the right hands. Weeks after the complete reactivation of the Odyssey 1, the port of Palm Beach awoke to unusual activity. Television crews, foreign reporters, and investors gathered to witness the yacht's relaunch, now reborn as a symbol of technological resilience. Madison arrived early, wearing the navy blue uniform of Ward Oceanic, her badge hanging from her pocket and her expression calm, carrying the composure of someone who had already faced the impossible. The vessel gleamed under the sun, the company's logo shining on its hull like a seal of rebirth. Ethan Ward waited for her on the main deck, joined by government representatives and chief engineers from other firms. His speech was brief. This project was rebuilt by minds that believe in precision, discipline, and courage. What brought us here today wasn't luck, it was competence. Then he motioned for Madison to step forward. Everything you see today exists because of the work of the person who stood at the center of the failures and turned chaos into stability. Engineer Madison Cole, this ship is your legacy. She stood steady, making no grand gestures, only nodding slightly as applause filled the deck. After the ceremony, the demonstration voyage began. The Odyssey 1 glided forward with flawless smoothness, cutting through the water in a silence so perfect it felt unreal. The hybrid system operated with precision, the monitors displaying efficiency levels surpassing all previous targets. Investors snapped photos, technicians exchanged impressed comments, and Madison monitored every reading with quiet focus. Ethan remained beside her, observing the reaction around them. "They believe in what they see," he said. "But do you believe in what you built?" She didn't look up from the control panel. "I believe in the process. It's the only thing that never lies." He smiled faintly. There was truth in her simplicity. No corporate speech could express better what she had accomplished. The woman who had once arrived at the shipyard, covered in grease, voiceless and overlooked, now commanded a system redefining the future of naval engineering. The media would call it a miracle, but Madison knew there were no miracles in machinery, only calculation, persistence, and the determination of those who refused to surrender to their own guilt. By afternoon, the yacht had anchored at a marina in the Bahamas for a private international event. Representatives from multiple companies gathered on the deck to discuss partnerships for sustainable maritime technologies. Madison presented the final technical report, her tone precise and confident, her slides detailed and exact. She explained, "The integration between the electric propulsors and the new balance control system, proving that efficiency and safety weren't opposing goals, but two halves of the same principle." When she finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. One of the investors remarked with a grin, "I've heard plenty of engineers talk about machines, but rarely one who speaks of integrity with the same certainty." Ethan, listening from a distance, simply replied, "Integrity is what keeps a ship standing." The phrase spread quietly among the guests, capturing the spirit of the project. Madison allowed herself no pride, only gathered her notes and returned to her station. She knew true recognition wasn't found in applause. It was in the sea's silent trust each time it allowed the ship to move forward. In the months that followed, Ward Oceanic expanded its reach. The new line of sustainable vessels secured international contracts and government partnerships. Madison, now Global Director of Engineering, traveled between branches, overseeing production and mentoring young teams. She had become both a technical and moral reference. Universities invited her to lecture, and students saw in her a living example that failure isn't the end of a career, but the beginning of real mastery. Ethan consulted her on every technical decision, maintaining the same professional respect as always. Between them, there was no forced hierarchy, no symbolic gestures, only mutual trust. The storm that had nearly destroyed the Odyssey 1 had become, over time, a turning point in both the company's history and the industry itself. And within that transformation, Madison had found not redemption, but purpose. One morning, she returned to the Odyssey 1, now docked permanently as a technological museum for students and engineers. The deck was quiet, and the sound of gentle waves against the hull echoed the endless rhythm of the sea. She walked to the command bridge and ran her hand along the main panel, which still functioned perfectly even after months without sailing. She took a deep breath, recalling the day the vessel had seemed doomed and the moment she chose to take control when everyone else hesitated. That single act, trusting her own reasoning, had changed everything. A young employee approached, curious. "Engineer Cole, how did you know what to do during that storm?" Madison smiled faintly. "You can't know. You just try the right way." The simplicity of her answer held the essence of her entire journey. Precision and courage, without dramatics. As the sun began to set, a golden reflection spread across the Odyssey One's hull while the harbor lights flickered on in sequence. Madison remained on the deck for a few more moments, gazing at the horizon. The sea before her no longer stirred fear, nor nostalgia. It was simply the natural landscape of someone who had learned to live with forces that cannot be controlled, only respected. Ethan appeared in the distance, speaking with a group of engineers. When he spotted her, he raised a hand in greeting. She returned the gesture and slowly descended the side stairs toward the dock. The wind carried the same salty scent that had once reminded her of loss. Now it spoke only of continuity. The Odyssey One remained steady, a symbol of a renewed company and of a woman who rebuilt more than a ship. Madison Cole had restored to Ward Oceanic not only its credibility, but something far greater, the certainty that knowledge, when driven by courage, is the most unshakable force there is. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.